Hey folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about movies, music, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new country album from Keith Urban titled Fuse. You know, I think over the past several years, I've kind of been unfair to Keith Urban. And at first glance, you could understand why. The rise and success of Keith Urban and his type of handsome, inoffensive pop country is a sort of direction for country music that gets on my nerves, mostly because of a marked shift in instrumentation, production, and themes. The songwriting just gets a little shallower in order to court mass market appeal, the production is a little bit more bland to sand down the rough edges, the instrumentation is simplified, often dramatically, and it's all fronted by a succession of musicians who look distinctly too polished to be performing country music. What's worse is that many of these acts attempt to co-opt traditional country elements into their songwriting, and it oftentimes sounds forced, inauthentic, and fake. That's why I tend to get really angry about the pandering to Southern pride. It just doesn't feel real to me. Now, to his credit, Keith Urban has rarely, if ever, done this, and I think there's a few very simple reasons why. Firstly, he's actually Australian, not American, and thus probably didn't grow up with the same cultural attitudes instilled inside his mind that might push him to adopt styles that don't match his image. Secondly, despite the more polished style of music that Keith Urban has written, produced, and performed throughout his career, it feels authentic with his image. He's always seemed distinctly comfortable in his stylistic choices, and the fact that, unlike some country singers, he actually seems like a genuinely nice guy means that he's not going to co-opt somebody else's style if it doesn't work for him. Thirdly and finally, Keith Urban is actually a pretty good songwriter on his own, or with some of his songwriters that he brings in to help, so that he's never needed to run to the country song generating machine that Nashville has turned into for some artists that produces the same sort of bland sludge that gets popular. Now, that being said, the majority of many critics' issues with Keith Urban isn't that he's offensive or all that bad, but that he's kind of boring. It's sort of like the same issue that I have with Jay Sean. Not that the music is all that egregiously awful, but that it doesn't really inspire that much emotion. If I wanted to be a crass asshole, I could call him a pretty face without a lot of substance, but that's not entirely fair or entirely true because he has indeed written some solid, catchy, occasionally emotionally evocative tunes, and I really can't hate the guy. To me, I've always slotted him in with Rascal Flatts as a country act that's a little bit too polished and a little bit too slick for me to get really enthused about, but nobody I can really take offense with either. But as I said, I may have been a little bit unfair to the guy, because his new album Fuse reportedly was described as Keith Urban trying a new artistic direction, which was enough to catch my interest and give the new album a look. After all, Keith Urban has been around long enough in the scene of solo male country singers to practically be considered an elder statesman of the genre. So, with all that in mind, how does the new album Fuse turn out? Well, believe it or not, it's actually pretty good. However, this is definitely an album that will turn off people who don't go into it with the right expectations. If you're looking for a rough, grimy country album about drinking beer, driving trucks, and kicking ass, well, why the hell are you listening to Keith Urban in the first place? But you're not going to get that album here. In fact, the first big qualification I'd make when talking about Fuse is that, well, it's barely a country album, at least on the surface. The production is very much pop, sanding down all of the rough edges to take Keith Urban's already very polished delivery to make it even friendlier for pop radio. It's definitely a stylistic shift in line with the one that Taylor Swift made with Red, to the point where I'd have a hard time calling Keith Urban a country artist in the same way. In fact, the majority of the songs that attempt to have more rough edges and banjo and rock guitar just don't work in the same way because the production is so slick and polished, and thus any of the harder instrumentation just feels completely toothless or shoved to the background. And you know, the amazing thing is that this shift in style completely works for me. In one way, it's kind of obvious. Keith Urban has always straddled the line between pop and country, so his shift to a more pop direction isn't all that surprising, and in some way really isn't that much of a sellout. And I'll say this, his voice, a more smooth tenor with less of an accent, it's a real natural fit for pop radio, arguably more so than it was for country radio. And even though I have a preference for rough-edged, textured country music over Keith Urban's more polished brand of music, I won't dismiss an act for making a turn towards pop music, particularly when it's a really good fit for the artist, as it is here. However, as good as a fit as Keith Urban the singer is for pop radio, some of the more acoustic instrumentation doesn't quite mesh as well with the more electronic production, and there are a couple of real jarring moments throughout the album where the electronic drum machines don't quite seem to fit well with the organic guitars. Although Keith Urban is a lot better at fusing country with modern pop than the majority of his contemporaries, there are still moments that don't quite work as well as they could. A niggling complaint from me comes up in the vocal production especially. Occasionally there are just moments of sloppiness where his voice is either a bit too loud or a bit too quiet in contrast with the instrumentation, which should have really been cleaned up a bit. That being said, on songs where Keith Urban does go for straight out country, like on the uber patriotic duet with Eric Church called Raise 'Em Up, he still has the chops, particularly on guitar, to really make it work. Now this takes us to Keith Urban himself, and I'll reiterate what I said about him earlier. He seems like a nice, good, down-to-earth kind of guy, and he never phones it in on his vocal delivery. He sounds really completely sincere, and that does wonders for giving his more sentimental songs a fair bit of emotional heft. And completely honestly, it surprised me how much it actually worked. That being said, whenever he and his songwriters try to write a more modern country song, complete with some of the leering obsession with picking up girls, it's completely ridiculous, mostly because Keith Urban sounds so far out of his element. This is the same issue that Jay Sean had with On Neon, but Keith Urban makes the wise decision to mostly avoid songs like this, where he's expected to sound like some kind of tough guy badass, and instead stick with some of his softer material. This guy is best equipped to make exuberant love songs, with a little bit more of a softer touch, and when he's working in that area, it works like gangbusters. If I'm going to criticize his vocals just a bit though, I will say that his attempts at falsetto on She's My 11 really do fall flat for me. His voice in this range is very weak and it just didn't work. But that's one song, and for the most part, Keith Urban completely nails his vocal delivery. Sincere, heartfelt, and genuinely emotionally evocative. Now, of course, the reason that the sentimentality works here for me better than it normally does in this kind of country music is fairly simple. There are plenty of well-written songs on this album. This has always been a hidden strength of Keith Urban, and one that kind of sneaked up on me in a good way. It made songs like Cop Car, where he and his sweetheart get busted by cops their father sent after they ran off, feel surprisingly authentic, mostly because of the little details and Keith Urban's heartfelt delivery. That's always something I liked about this album. The songs have a very naturally free-flowing verse quality, filled with little moments of poetry that you'll completely miss on your first listen, and yet you'll really grow on you later. I'll say this for Keith Urban, it really helps that he sells wistful heartbreak quite well on songs like Somewhere in My Car and Come Back to Me and We Were Us. And again, it's in the little details that both set the scene and add moments in context that I really liked. If I'm going to nitpick a bit here, I will say that there are a couple of lines throughout some of the album's less memorable tracks that do fall a little flat for me, but they're in the minority. And yeah, there's the typical Southern pride elements that, I gotta be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of. But Keith Urban manages to make them less grating, mostly because, well, instead of shoving it in your face, he uses those elements to enhance the atmosphere of the song, adding authenticity and texture and making these moments feel real. And, you know, I dug the hell out of it. So, in summary, I liked Keith Urban's Fuse a lot more than I expected I would. Now, I know that some people are going to be braying that it's a sellout. And sure, let's call it that. But if so, it's the kind of sellout that works so well, showing an evolution in the sound while keeping the integrity of the good songwriting intact. It's pop country to be sure, but it's damn good pop country all the same. If there was a little bit more polish in the production and instrumentation, it'd probably be one of the stronger albums of the year for me. As it is, it's still pretty solid all the same. If you're a fan of Keith Urban or music in the pop country vein, particularly if you're a fan of Taylor Swift, you'd probably like Fuse. And look, if you're angry that Keith Urban sold out or some other nonsense, well, give this album a listen to anyway. You might find yourself a little bit surprised in how much you like it. I certainly was. So yeah, if you'd like to like and subscribe, I've got more videos coming up on the way. It's going to be a busy couple of days. See you next time.